split squats, rear foot elevated split squats, and front foot elevated split squats. All are popular options in lower body programs, but what are the main differences? Because I think the water can get a little bit murky when trying to decide which one to use based on the adaptations you want. So in this video, we're gonna talk about each split squat individually and when I personally would program and use them in lower body training. So in the context of this video, the traditional split squat is gonna be kind of like our gold standard. I'm not gonna program a rear foot elevated or front foot elevated variation until a lifter has showed that they're competent with just traditional split squats. So that being said, why would we use them? Well, for starters, they are going to be a fundamental movement pattern. I think it's a movement pattern that every lifter should own and be good at. Being able to produce strength from a unilateral lower body standpoint is not only going to be great for your lifting and being cognizant of how each side of your body is functioning, but also it can have carryover to sports because we are not going to always have that perfect bilateral stance that we display in things like the back squat. So right off the bat, it's going to be a fantastic variation for anybody who does want to get better at lower body training, improve their stability with their lower body, improve their single leg strength, and eventually get into slightly more advanced variations. So now when it comes to muscles worked for the traditional split squat, we're going to be able to work the quads, the glutes, and the hamstrings to some degree. Now we can alter how we're working these slightly by paying attention to our joint angles and how we're performing this. So if we're letting the knee track forward more, for example, we can target the quads a little bit better. We'll be putting a greater stretch on them. So why traditional split squat? It is going to be a fundamental movement pattern that every lifter should own and be good at before moving into more advanced variations. In addition, it's a great variation for improving single leg stability and strength and also targeting the quads, glutes, and hamstrings to some degree. All right, so why rear foot elevated split squats, also called Bulgarian split squats? Well, I filmed a video on this movement before that's a full tutorial, so check that out if you haven't and if you want to learn more about this movement. But right out of the gate, if I am programming this for a lifter, it is to bias our attention towards the quad. So having that back foot elevated, we can kind of feed into almost like this forward-esque posture because we can shift weight a little bit easier onto that front leg. So if I'm trying to focus on the quad specifically with an athlete and want to use a split squat variation, rear foot elevated is often going to be my go-to. Now, if we look at it from a more athletic standpoint, the rear foot elevated split squat could arguably be a great variation for focusing on initial reaction force off the ground. So when we're concentrically contracting and trying to create power off the ground, the Bulgarian split squat is kind of putting us into a position to do so. So if we think about how when we start running, right, we're starting to dig into the ground with the toes, we have that slight forward lean. That's going to be somewhat similar with this variation in the context that the knee is going to track a little bit more. We're going to have a lot of quad activity, and that could create some carryover to a more athletic focused approach with this exercise when it comes to improving reaction force from that initial concentric phase in athletic movement. In addition to biasing the quads and potentially having carryover for athletics when it comes to creating power through the ground, the rear foot elevated split squat can also be a good variation for improving stability and focusing on what the opposing hip is doing. When we only have one leg that is fully grounded and the other leg is kind of floating, we have to really focus on the stability of our pelvis when we're moving through this movement. Plus, we can pay attention to if that pelvis is opening, shutting it down, and getting more work out of this exercise. So why front foot elevated split squats? So when we elevate the front foot, we're generally going to increase the range of motion that our hip is going through at the very bottom of the movement. So in doing this, if we're trying to improve hip stability at greater ranges of motion, the front foot elevated split squat can be a useful tool to do so. In addition, with this variation, it's not really possible to lock out in a lot of cases with that front foot. So if we are trying to keep a lot of tension and effort on that front leg, this is usually a really great variation to use. So if you are trying to really drive effort high, never really lock out that front foot, and keep a lot of time under tension on the legs, front foot elevated split squat can be a useful tool. Now, looking at it from a more athletic standpoint, this could be a good variation for eccentric and absorption movement phases. So when we are doing, like, let's say single leg movements in any form of sport, we're gonna have a moment when we're kind of doing a propulsion phase. So like we mentioned in the rear foot elevated split squat, when we're creating that like a nice initial concentric phase or like that phase where we're initially creating force through the ground, we're gonna have a phase where we're absorbing our landing. So when we're in a position where the front foot is elevated, we're kind of biasing our ability to load eccentrically. So by having a deeper hip range of motion, we can target the posterior a little bit more. So those are 3 reasons why I would employ the front foot elevated split squat over other variations. They are a bit more specific than the other 2, but it doesn't mean that this exercise is not incredibly useful when employed with strategy. And that wraps up this video on traditional split squats versus rear foot elevated split squats versus front foot elevated split squats. Every single exercise will always have some variance in the adaptations we're gonna get out of them based on our individuality and how we plan to use them. If you ever have any other questions on this topic or on programming for that matter, drop them down below. So drop all your questions down there. And also guys, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.